today. It's not going to be our usual check-in or discussion space. We're going to be learning from Brandon, who we're going to be learning from. Or Andres.
Wait, what? Sorry, say that again.
Can you tease up the presentation? Oh, last thing before we talk about the presentation, the meeting is being streamed live to YouTube. That's the other bit of disclosure before we get into the meat of things. Brandon, you mind telling us about the presentation scheduled for today?
Yeah, so the other Andres today is going to talk to us about OpenFGA. It's called Open Fine Grain Authorization. The project is talking about how to scale authorization, and I think the interesting thing to know, especially when like kind of looking at this, is it's kind of going to CNCF sandbox. I think there's a lot of interesting applications here as we look at, when we talked about authorization in the past and in the tag, we said basically like everyone uses authorization, right? So this is, I think, a good opportunity to kind of take a look at this, and maybe this is a CNCF project that will be going to sandbox that we can start thinking about how others can integrate with it.
Fascinating. Andres, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll start sharing.
Open FGA. What does FGA stand for? Fine Grain Authorization.
Yes. Thank you. Glad you noticed. If not, we'll need to kind of rethink the name. And so, thank you, everyone. So this is the agenda. Why are we here? What is OpenFGA? What is fine grain authorization? How this compares with other ways of doing authorization? Why are we considering donating this to CNCF and applying to Sandbox and Q&A? So we work from Okta, from Auth0 that was acquired by Okta a year ago. And in the context of Auth0, we've been trying to solve how to build an authorization product that was generic enough for everyone to use it. And we got to a solution that is inspired in a project by Google called Google Zanzibar. As part of the ideation of the project, we wanted to donate to CNCF, and we had a conversation with Chris Stanishik a couple of weeks ago, and he suggested that we presented it to you, so we can, before finishing the submission to Sandbox, we have a first round of feedback, see if you think this is something that will work well in the context of tag security, of CNCF, and any other feedback you might have. Okay? So that's why we decided to schedule the presentation and why we are here. So, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with this project. Google published a paper in 2019. The link is below. You can Google it, and that describes how they solved fine grain authorization in their platform. And what they created was a product that they called Google Zanzibar. They never published the code of that product, but of that solution. But there's a document that describes how it works. And they've been using it for all of the product suites, from like granting permissions to accessing to virtual machines, to Google Documents, when you click the share button in a Google document, to share your videos in YouTube, Google Photos. All of the Google products use this framework, this system. And the main difference it has with other approaches is that it's what they are calling, it's called relationship-based access control. And so instead of using role-based and attribute-based, they model the permissions based on how different entities in their software relate to others. Okay, so you're going to have some entities like documents, users, folders, groups of people, organizations, and they are going to relate somehow, and they're going to have certain roles in those relationships, and you model your permission model that way. Okay? And we're going to see that it's more expressive than other ways of defining authorization, and that's why Google could use it for many different products, right? The challenge in general when you get to a generic solution for final authorization is how to define something that is flexible and expressive enough for multiple domains. And that's why Google found a way to do it, and why we thought implementing a product with those ideas and making it open source was something that was worth pursuing. Yes, Andres.
Yes, quick question if appropriate. Do you rather answer questions as they pop up in chat, or do you want to leave them towards the end?
Yes, we can do it when they pop up. I might be distracted, so if someone, if I miss the question, let me know, right?
So Aradna is asking, how do you define the relationships?
Perfect. Yeah, we are gonna get there. So yeah, bear with me for a few minutes.
This is a graph, just to be clear.
It's a directed graph.
Okay. DAG.
Yeah. So, and this is in general how you would do it is like you have different users accessing different resources. In this case, it could be devices, and they could perform different actions on different devices. And the other thing is that in addition of having multiple resources and access per user, you could have different products that you apply similar permission models. Like, for example, you can think that users, groups, and organizations are global across a set of products, and the permissions in each of those products are different. You can reuse some of those relationships, and you can reuse the same concepts that you are using to monitor authorization across a product suite. If you think about final authorization and why it's becoming more relevant in our applications, right? They're kind of different from social media, where you want to control who can see what, to like scenarios that are more like work related, like sharing a document in Google Docs. All of those require that you are granting permissions to a very specific set of people to perform some actions in a specific resource. Okay, and to do that to a scale that can support applications like Facebook or Google Docs, it's difficult to do. And there's also another edge of this, which is not only granting permissions, but accessing for requesting access, right? And you can see that in a simple scenario like Google Docs, or in the right, that's a UI from an internal product that we use to ask for permission to get, in this case, to an Amazon account with a specific role, right? In these cases are scenarios where it's not that I'm sharing, but I'm requesting access, and someone needs to approve it, right? And in that case, I'm getting fine-grained access to a resource that someone else approved. And this is kind of moving all the authorization management to end users, like instead of being like a centralized by the IT admins or whatever on the company, right? So in general, this is instead of having all the permissions managed by a small group of people, you have a large set of permissions that are managed by a large set of users. And in some of these cases, what you need is auditing. So someone will want to know what are the permissions that I have in specific virtual machines or things like that, and review them frequently to make sure we are compliant with internal policies and things like that. So let's go through like how this model of relationship-based authentication compares to other ones that are commonly used in the industry today. So role-based, in this scenario where I want to build an application to approve expenses, and this is the way you model it in Auth0, but it's very similar in whatever other solution you have. And the way we do it is you define roles with some names. For each role, you have specific permissions. In the case of an approver, you have approve expenses and view expenses. Submitter, you have submit expenses and view expenses. When a user logs in, depending on the role they have, you're going to get an access token with a set of permissions in the access token. And the way you're going to handle this is in somewhere when you're calling an API, somehow you can it can be like in a policy engine, it could be your own code. Somewhere you're going to check if the user has permission to execute that action. In this case, view or approve expenses. Right? So this is very commonly used and across applications. In the way this works, the way I define the permission is I can approve expenses, but in general, what I want to say or define is I can approve expenses of my direct reports, right? Not everyone's expenses, right? So how do I do that? How do I define that with role-based access? is not possible, very difficult at least, right? So in general, you need more expressiveness than what role-based gives you if you want to define permissions for a specific record in your database, or a specific set of records in the database. In this case, will be the ones that were submitted by my direct reports. How do you solve that? You could use that, you could solve that problem using attribute-based authorization. And in that case, in addition of checking if a user has permission to approve expenses, in this case, you might check that the user that is approving the expense is actually the manager of the expense submitter, okay? So you can write up, this is a policy written in a language called Polar from a product, open source product called OSO. And there are multiple ways you can do this. This is one, right? And so you can write a policy that expresses that, but that policy requires data. Okay, so to be able to evaluate this, I will need to go to a database, based on the expense ID, get what is the manager of the user that submitted it, in addition of additional data that I might need, and provide that data to the policy. Okay, and that works fine. And the main issue it has is that I need to get the data, right, to evaluate the policy, and that is not always easy. And sometimes that data, like in this case, probably it's in the same database that you're using for your operational database, right? And so all the load that is required to evaluate permission comes to the same store that you're using for everything else, right? So it hits your operational data store a lot. And that usually implies like an increased latency in authorization checks, which is a problem because you need to check for authorization in every API call. And if you have a change of API calls in all of those, right? So, and then what if I want to do other things? Like, let's say, in addition of saying I want this expense can be approved by the manager, I only also want to get it approved by the manager's manager. So whoever there is a manager in that manager chain, right? I could do that. I can now add another query here that retrieves all the managers' lists and submit that to the policy, and the policy can evaluate that, right? But it becomes more complex to start writing those queries and more load that is introduced in the pipeline, right? So let's see how a problem like this can be solved with relationship-based access control. This is the way this works in OpenFGA, but the concepts that are exposed in the Google paper, right? So there's nothing here that is the language. It's kind of something we created for OpenFGA, but conceptually it's the same. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say there's a type that is an employee that has a relationship, that is manager. That itself, it means that I can assign it. So I can assign the manager for a specific employee, or that the manager of an employee, it's also the manager from the manager. Okay, so if I have assigned a manager to this user, I can traverse that graph and find the manager of the manager will also be a manager. And I will define that the report has an approver that needs to be the manager of the submitter of the report. And the submitter is defined as someone I can assign. So when I create a report, I will assign a submitter. That is the model that I define for this specific authorization problem, and with the entities and relationships I want. Then I need to define a certain set of tuples. And these tuples are going to be stored on the OpenFGA store. Okay? And so the difference is the database of permissions is not your operational database, it's the OpenFGA database. In this case, I'm creating three tuples. I'm saying that Matt is the manager of Daniel is the manager of Sam, and that Sam submitted this report. Okay? And then I'm going to ask FGA, like what they want, OpenFGA, the main thing it does, it tries to answer the question, is this user capable of performing this action or has this relationship with this specific resource, right? So that's check a permission, right? And the way you could write it in natural language will be, is employee Matt related to report Sam as an approver? Okay? In this case, Matt is the manager of Sam's manager. And the way we'll answer this is going to start with the Sam trip, who's an approver, whoever is in the approver relationship of the reports. That can be the manager, okay? And the manager of Sam is Daniel, but Daniel is not Matt, so I cannot answer the question this way. It can also be Daniel's managers, and Daniel's manager is Matt. So I found the answer and I replied yes. So basically, when I'm asking OpenFGA to check for a permission, it's going to traverse the graph and tell me if it's if that's approved or not, right? See if it's true or false. And so the main difference with REBAC and ABAC is that you have more expressiveness. You can define things that are difficult or impossible to define in other models. And also you have a data store, which is OpenFGA, which is optimized to answer this question at scale, okay? You are not putting that load in your data model, your databases, but you're having a different database that is optimized to answer these kind of questions. Stop here and see if there are any questions about this.
Hey, Andres, just a quick couple of questions. So in here you have two levels of managers, right? I think it's Matt and Daniel. So if you have multiple levels, does this mean you need to define a new model and then define new tuples corresponding to that model? Is that the way this is going to work?
In this case, given that that relationship is kind of recursive, I could define here another manager for Matt, right? And that will work, right? And then if I like, it's like Ash is the manager of Matt, and then I say like, is employee Ash related to report Sam as approval, it will say yes. Okay. If I need to have other kind of relationships, I can add them to the model and then add the related tuples.
So basically you start with the model for your data, and then you have to create these tuples, which are nothing but bindings for that model. And then it's a query, right? It's a three-step process, basically. Okay, got it.
Yes. Parth, go ahead.
So my question is, in terms of like the tuples, how is the data getting? Is it like a manual process of entering data, or is there a way of like maybe taking Active Directory or something?
Okay. So that's a good question, right? So there are basically two main APIs you want to call, write and check. Write is the one to add tuples, and check is the one to check for permissions, right? Check if a user can perform an action. Right now, the way to add these tuples is to call the write API, right? Part of the things we want to build are tools or plugins to synchronize this with Scheme, and so you can plug any directory and get it synchronized, right? Or specific things for specific directory providers like Okta or Zero or Ashray or whatever thing, right? But that's an area which where we expect also like the open source community to help us, right? In the sense of there's a lot of things we can build around this product. And that's one of the reasons that having it in open source is gonna be beneficial for us and for the community, we think. That's a good question. It's something that it makes sense, right? A lot of those relationships are already defined in your directory, like groups and users. And so it's great if you don't need to define them again, right? And there are some standards to let you have those directories synchronized. We can take advantage of those, like Scheme. Andres.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a naive question. You covered considerations for scale. Can you talk a little bit about the deployment model in a multi-tenant environment? Would you share a single data store? Would you use multiple data stores? Would some of the tuples be protected cryptographically?
Okay, so today, today, the way we handle this, so we are deploying this product as one of our product offerings, and we support it, and we handle multi-tenancy in a single store, right? And that's the way we are doing it today. And as far as I know, we are not having like a specific, like different keys, different encryption keys for different customers. As far as I know, maybe Jonathan can help me there, but I think we are not doing that today. And in the context of OpenFGA, there are more options because like every customer can define to deploy it in the way they want, right? So they could define a specific store per tenant, and we also think we're going to be providing ways to help customers implement multi-tenancy on their side in a single store to make that simple. And but we haven't considered yet having like a encryption keys per customer and do that. But yeah, that's something that makes sense too. Okay, So move forward. So why do we think it's interesting to partner or to donate this with CNCF? So what do we? So this will be like the question for the sandbox questionnaire, where we say why do we think we should submit it with CNCF and what's the value for both? And so our theory there is that modern apps frequently need user-driven fingerprint authorization. That's what I tried to show initially. And right now there's a lot of hype around Zanzibar style authentication, and there's kind of the promise there that it's a good way to implement cloud native FGA, so something that is designed to scale and for large software services like what kind of Google could require. And we think given that there's a large opportunity for building tooling and integrations across a lot of things, having this being open source and having a widely adopted open source solution will be beneficial for the community in general, right? And at least there are some of the possible integrations that can be built, like SDKs. We are building an integration with Open Policy Engine. You can just, from an open policy, call an FGA and figure out if you can perform an action or not, like a process like Envoy. We have customers that are integrating it with Backstage IO frameworks, client-side frameworks, integrating with Scheme as part of suggested. Right? And we believe that having the kind of community that we are kind of finding in CNCF will help us get there. And that product that is part of CNCF and also sponsored by a company like Zero and Okta can also give enough trust to early adopters to kind of try the product and try to build a community sooner than later. So that's kind of why we feel it's a good match. And that's my presentation. So the project is still not open source. If you go there, you're going to see it like without the repos. We are kind of turning the key, we are planning to do that on June 20th. Okay, and we are going through internal processes to let us open source this and be compliant with legal and all of the things that we need to do. And we plan to submit it to Sandbox around that date, probably around a few weeks after June 20th. That's where we are.
This is your pre-launch.
This is like the first contact with outside with an audience like this, right? So
very cool. So you are telling us about your hopes and aspirations. Can you tell us about your worst fears? I'm joking.
My worst fears. That's good. Yeah. So for Okta and Zero, so we've been working in open source for a while. We use a lot of open source projects. We have a lot of open source libraries, but we never went into build a product that is going to be a kind of a core offering of our company that is going to be also built on open source software, right? Like we support, right? So that's kind of a big change for the company, and it's a one that I'm very excited to be part of, right? But yes, inside of the company, there are kind of this is scary, right? So we don't know how it's going to work. Of course, we'll eventually want to have a business on top of this, right? It's different when you have an open source product, and we are excited about how it will be. But I think that's where we're coming from, right? So doing this for the first time in a company like ours, and try to understand the impact that we'll have in our product line.
For sure. With that in mind, can you speak a little to how do you envision pluggability, extensibility? Certainly within CNCF, you want to grow integrations into the ecosystem. How do you see downstream onto enterprise product offerings? We talked a little about IDPs, maybe other ancillary or orthogonal enterprise offerings. Do you have a roadmap for that?
No, and trying to think out loud, but just going back to the list. But I think most of the things we've been considering are things like API gateways, proxies, more infrastructure than specific product lines. IDPs is a good one, right? And that goes, of course, beyond our own products. And but as we all know, all products need authorization, right? And I'm sure like there will be products from different companies that could take advantage of this, but we haven't thought anything specific. There's one there which is Backstage, which is kind of different from that perspective. The Backstage is a dev portal, so it's more a portal product where that requires authorization. So it's not a platform play, more like an application that needs authorization, and where we have one customer that now is integrating with it because they use Backstage and they want to use OpenFGA.
Can I mention a few things as well? Is that okay?
Yes, please.
So, first of all, thanks for the opportunity to speak here today. This is awesome. I've been in the identity and access management space for like 7 years. And when I had this opportunity to join this team and work on OpenFGA, I was ecstatic because I think we're really well positioned being at Okta and Auth0 to be building a product, for the community like this, because we have a very strong presence in the authentication space, right? We're active leaders in defining authentication specifications and protocols that are used across the industry. And now we're also trying to help contribute back to the community an authorization and the access management part of identity and access management, right? And so I think the future of OpenFGA, I'm talking about like integrations within a larger community, is that we can help build OpenFGA around industry specifications around IDPs, right? OpenID Connect and other industry standards, and help make the adoption of an access management platform in any application have a little bit less friction than homegrown off-the-shelf solutions that kind of exist out there in the community right now. And then when you combine that with a really flexible authorization engine that's kind of inspired by Zanzibar, like we're starting to evolve in the community on a general authorization solution that can work for a lot of platforms. And that's something that even like 5 years ago, I didn't feel like you could really say existed in the open community. OPA has done a really good job at, kind of opening up some of that community. And I think we just need to continue to enrich the authorization space within the open source community. So I think OpenFGA is a really cool opportunity for this. And I think being with Okta and Auth0, we're well positioned with the identity management and access management kind of integration.
Well, that's very encouraging and reassuring to hear. I think you also touched on something that we've observed as an organization where there's been this stance for a really long time of decoupling Auth-N from Auth-C and dealing with those problem spaces separately. As part of that observation, we're seeing the pendulum swing the other direction of, well, there's actually so much overlap and such a tight intersection between authentication and authorization that the more we grow interfaces that pay consideration between that fine line between the two, the more meaningfully we can reason holistically about our authorization objectives, both like fine-grained identities, fine-grained policies. Can you speak a little bit to that? That's something you also see?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. Like you said, what I've noticed in the community is there has been that separation, right? You have very strong footed identity protocols and specifications, OpenID Connect, OAuth 2 for delegated authorization and such. And these are very well established, very well adopted protocols and specifications. But then over on the access management side of things, it's significantly lacking. I mean, you hear terms like XACML and, these different kinds of policy expression languages and such. But there's nothing that really actually ties together like your IDP and your directories, right, with the actual authorization policies that apply to your data model, to your APIs, to your applications. And furthermore, I think that's because authorization is really hard, right? It's really hard to build a super flexible authorization engine that can answer any arbitrary questions that you might have for it, given the wide variety of different authorization models that can exist out in the world. And so if you're trying to build a general purpose engine that can serve any application, that becomes really hard, especially if you don't have the data loaded into that engine to answer more fine-grained, authorization questions. So I think what we have here is, and what Zanzibar has really kind of inspired, which is why I see so much community involvement around it right now, is that finally you can co-locate the data with super flexible authorization engine and answer really challenging authorization questions at large scale when you deploy that solution in an appropriate manner. And then when you factor in other integrations and leadership from Okta and Auth0 and such in the identity space, right? Like, we have an opportunity for an open source product here that can evolve alongside some of the evolution of our authentication specifications and such. And when we add additional integrations with Active Directories and other kind of directory services, I think we'll see a really rich ecosystem come to the community around the more holistic identity and access management space. So yeah, does that answer your question, Andres?
It does. It does. I have some more thought on it to keep on peeling on that thread, but Parth has a question, so we can come back to it. But yeah, super engaging. Thank you. Parth?
Thanks. Yes. I just had a quick question. So I'm thinking along the lines of like zero trust. So is there a way to, is it like continuously validating, or is it like, hey, one time, once you're validated, once you're kind of good to go? Or does it, is it kind of like time out eventually, or does it recheck? Kind of like that. That's kind of like the zero trust kind of thing.
The way it works is you are going to call our API, our check API, right? Each time you need to know if a user can perform an action, right? In general, it will be a part of your API code. You're going to call us, right? So they will depend on you how frequently you want to call us, right? And but it's not that we are continuously evaluating and let you know if something changed, right? It's more, you call us, we answer it as fast as we can.
Understood. Thank you.
Frederick?
So do you have any best practices that you've already been looking at, perhaps? Because there's a couple, I can see there being possible issues around, let's say, latency, where every time you make a call, if you have to make a database connection out to revalidate something. But at the same time, you also have things like caching, or perhaps there's best practices that you have where maybe the requests get inlined and set, or the claims get inlined in such a way that you can validate them down the chain without having to add in additional connections that add in that latency. So do you, like, I'm pretty sure you've thought about some of these things. So like, do you have a set of best practices set up for people who are going to be looking at this early on, or are you just going to let the community try to decide that over time?
Jonathan, you want to answer that one?
Yeah, sure. So we do have, right, within the authorization space, there's a lot of different subproblems, right? You have direct checks, like, does a user have access or this permission on this particular resource? And then you have the opposite question as well. You have, what resources does this user have access to, right? And then within that as well, you might have a search problem as well, right? Like, show me all of the, render an Elasticsearch query, right? And show me only resources that this user has view access to, right? So those are kind of like the three primary problems, I think. And we will have best practice recommendations for how to solve those problems with the Open FGA API, right? Today, just to be transparent, today we support the checks. We support the, does user have view access to this resource? And we're quickly emerging on a architecture and solution for the reverse lookups, right? Like, what resources does a user have, one or more permissions for? And we'll bring some solutions to the table for the search problem as well. So that, in regards to best practices, yes, we will have recommendations for, in these kinds of scenarios, when you're asking these kinds of authorization questions, these are the recommendations that we have. Now, as far as like the performance questions that you kind of alluded to go, right, that a lot of the novelty that we're building upon comes from kind of Zanzibar's architecture. And in their architecture, it's a highly distributed architecture that depends on caching, and it depends on clever request shedding, right? So you make multiple requests to a database in hopes that one completes before the other, right? So we're going to be, and we are employing certain tactics such as that to improve performance, to reduce contention on the database, to reduce queries to the database through clever caching and distributed caching topologies. So yes, like all of those things are part of kind of the fabric and the core engine that is OpenFGA. Does that answer your question, Frederick?
Yeah, that definitely helps, and I assume you'll also have things to, because it's not just about the user accounts, but also what are the systems that are connecting into it? Have they met our authentication? From an authentication perspective, have they met certain requirements that you can then use to validate whether you should approve it or not? So, but my assumption is that based upon the structure there, like if we were to tie in something like Spiffy as an example, and we were to validate the mutual TLS transport, that I don't see any reason why that part won't work, considering you just have the API there, and you have to make sure you bind against the right set of things there. So. So I think what you presented is really good. Ties in several things that have been on my mind about. It's not just about the roles. It's not just about the attributes, but you're trying to look at it in a more holistic, high level view as to whether something should work across several of these properties in a holistic way. I do have one other question in regards to, if let's say that I have an environment that I want to authorize, or I have some requests I want to authorize. Is considering you're using a logic language here, or at least it looks like a logic language, do you have the ability to combine different roles? Like if the context of what the requester is coming in is different, would I have the opportunity to perhaps dynamically bring in the right set of rules for that particular thing, or is it a static system where I'd have to pre-populate all those ahead of time?
Yeah, so I think what you're alluding to is like policies that depend on like context, request context, essentially. Like, is this request coming from a given IP range or a given geo or something like that? And yeah, we have thought through use cases like that, and we call them contextual tuples. So the idea is within the scope of a request that you make to OpenFGA, you would provide additional tuples that indicate additional context. That is essentially, you would calculate the context client side, and then you pass in the tuples to represent that context, and you'll either get, an authorized, an allow or deny back from the engine based on those contextual tuples that you pass in. So yeah, for more like request context specific policies and such, but we've got that covered. Andres, do you have anything more to add there?
No, it's just like, yeah, so we already have the documentation for the SaaS product that is public. We are going to have a similar version of this documentation for the open source version when we open source it. It will be pretty similar. And and this is kind of what shows that is scenario here where you can add specific tuples that are part of the request, right? So if you want to say something that is not static, but depending on the request, like in this case, IP or time, you can add that as new kind of facts that are part of the tuples that will be evaluated to evaluate the policy.
So something I'm hearing here resonates with an area of work that Frederick, myself, and others have been thinking really hard about for a long time within the Spiffy project, approaching it entirely from an authentication angle. We're dubbing the problem transitive identity, but is precisely like, how do you retain this context across a complex application call chain? You have multiple apps built by multiple services. You have a service at the end of the chain that the auth C rule is, well, only like last service can call me, but there's actually no context of what user or what claims were made when the actual call chain was triggered, initiated by the user. And like we thought about, well, do we extend like JOTs, like embed those claims in there? That does seem that this framework, like Fred, like resonates with me. I don't know if I'm conflating things around transitive identity, but
Yeah, I agree with you entirely on that. I don't know if this project it certainly helps towards solving a transitive identity, but I don't know if, because you have to have rules that span a complex context. So it's not just that I receive something, but you're looking at the various things that it's gone through. But I think that there's still an authentication piece that needs to be solved, because you don't want an attacker to, like, yeah, if something goes through A, through B, through C, if you're using mutual TLS, like A and B can validate each other, and B and C can validate each other, but A and C have no path to do so. And so, how do you guarantee that the whole chain from A, B to C is the one that is the one that it actually went through, when you don't have a complete way to validate the whole chain? And there's some techniques that we've explored that can possibly solve those particular problems. And I think that the way that you model your authorization may provide an easy way to validate some of the authentication aspects. Like, I don't think we should combine the two, because I get uncomfortable with combining authentication and authorization, but I think they can complement each other very well.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I don't see this as a solution for that problem, but maybe can help in some area.
yeah, additional context, right? Well, we're almost, like, I think you guys are concluded with the presentation. What call to action, other than, hey, await, the project's getting open sourced, you're submitting it, you're making the proposal to sandbox it with the CNCF. What would you like to direct folks' attention to? How to get involved, how to get engaged? What kind of initial involvement do you expect from the community?
So in the main goal of this instance was to make you aware of this is going to happen, and you might get involved in reviewing the sandbox and the submission or not. I don't know how that works, and later we are going to try to engage with the CNCF community as much as we can, right? But it's something that is a learning experience from us. So it's not that we know what are the next steps that I want to take, and we will need to kind of build a community for this, and we'll use the tools we know how to do that, right? And later we want to kind of keep moving it forward in the CNCF chain, and we need to kind of start checking other boxes, right? Like improving our security posture and things like that we know we need to do, and we might need to ask you for help so doing the self-assessment and things like that, right? That are things that we will want to do after we open source it, to make sure we kind of have everything, at least the parts we can control easily, right, about the project, that will help us move forward. And we know that the community part is critical, and that's where we will see how it goes, right? So for that, it's more difficult to control from our side.
So I'm hearing several things, but, like, well, you're making the project available to the world. You're looking for people kicking the tires with it, getting engaged, participating on your communication channels, hopefully filing issues, contributing back through pull requests, all of it, right?
Yes.
Cool. Very cool. Go ahead. You're saying. Jonathan, anything else from you?
No, other than just want to say I'm looking forward to opening this up to the community, and getting feedback, getting submissions, helping to evolve RFCs, and help move the project in a way that's helping solve the majority of the community's problems. So authorization is still one of those, like, problems that everyone has and no one has a solid solution for. And I would love to see OpenFGA evolve to be one of those projects that helps solve that problem within a larger community. So looking forward to it.
Awesome stuff. Keep up the great work, guys.
Sorry, I do have a question for you, Andres. This is Rafat from Okta. You had a message there. You said particularly excited about MTLS, that RFC that you referenced there. The reason I'm asking is that I chair the OAuth work group at the IETF, and I'm interested to understand a little bit more which part are you interested specifically about. Is it the client authentication, or is that token binding part of that RFC?
Well, and the point in time, Jonathan was talking about like that reconvergence between auth and auth-C and paying closer consideration of the objects between one another. I just think that RFC exemplifies having like authentication, fine-grained authentication, and based off that, using like client-bound tokens and leveraging those for authorization, just exemplifying it. Something that I've seen a lot of uptake by API gateways, and just like being able to do, well, MTLS across boundaries or like off mesh to on mesh. So yeah, seeing that manifest in several different areas. But yeah, happy to sidebar. Maybe it's something to tee up for another tag security call, and we can like pull through the RFC and the work that while you're leading there, I think it'd be very beneficial for this community.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, sounds good. Thank you.
Awesome, good stuff. Fred, you have your hand up. I don't know if you have another question, else we can like shift gears.
I'll lower my hand. Sorry, just getting tired.
Aradna, Andy, I don't know if one of you two wants to like close us up. I don't know if we have any other items.
No, I think this was a great presentation. I need to read up a little bit more, especially use cases around. I'm working on a NEST working group for multi-cloud zero trust model. And there are some challenges that we'll identify, and I want to see how this will be able to solve some of those challenges, especially for fine-grained authorization. I also want to understand about data access, right? Not just application components, how we can further expand this to use data attributes to grant access to data elements. So these are some of the thoughts that came to my mind after listening to your presentation. And happy to discuss offline if that will help as well. But with that, I don't have anything else unless anyone else from this team has any questions, concerns, or comments.
Andrew Martin, closing thoughts.
Really appreciated the presentation. Find it particularly interesting. Nothing really to add that people haven't already brought up. Really interested to kind of consider the multi-tenanted implications that were brought up earlier with some of that graph traversal. Yeah, look forward to reading a bit more. Thank you again.
Yeah. We'll be seeing you guys around.
Yes, you will.
Awesome.
Thank you very much again for the nice presentation.
With that, meeting adjourned. Thanks again for your time.
Guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Andrew.